Hello, welcome. Today we are going to be talking with Dr. Rebecca Bailey. I'll be calling her Becky for the rest of this conversation. And today we're just going to be talking about 19th century labor in America and how it kind of developed during the industrialization period. And so we'll kind of be going through that and learning a little bit more about that period of American labor. So thank you. First off, thank you for joining me, Becky. I really appreciate it.
Great, thank you. It's a subject I love to talk about, so wonderful.
Great, me too. So,
Okay.
so starting off, pretty basic question, very general, but generally, what was the relationship between labor and capital in the 19th century in America?
Well, it underwent a cataclysmic change. At the beginning of the 19th century, the vast majority of American workers were still working in local or regional economies. And even though more people than we would think today, back then were actually working as wage laborers, people who did not live on their own farm. They were not self-sufficient people. There was a far higher number of people, even in the early 19th century, who were dependent on wages for living. But because of the locality and the regionalism, there was a face-to-face kind of reciprocity relationship between the people who worked and the people who supervised or profited most over their work. But by the end of the 19th century, we were well into becoming an industrial nation. The tip over point between who was living essentially a rural versus an urban or industrial life happened in 1920. So within a 100-year span of time, that changed dramatically. And that is what undergirds my comment about this cataclysmic shift, because as people became farther and farther separated between, you didn't look your boss in the eye every day, is what I'm saying, right? In the early 19th century, the worker and owner tended to work side by side or had that sort of face-to-face reciprocity. So when we think, well, how did the relationship between labor and capital change? That was a fundamental part of the shift, because the farther the owners, the controllers of the capital system, the owners of the industrial machines, the factories, the farther they got removed from the men and women who worked for them and with them, it was easier to think of those people as just another commodity, as just another, literally the metaphor, the image of people being cogs in the machine became a far more distinct reality within 100-year span of time.
Yeah, and going on that point of you used to, be able to not only look at your boss and see them every day, but then also with like I've heard and this is something I never really had absorbed well, I think, but like as far as our democracy goes, you used to vote in public. You would go up
Yes.
and write about, and everyone would see kind of who you voted for.
Yeah.
And so that included your boss, because you lived around your boss, and your boss would go, "Oh, who you voting for?" And so that
Right.
had a huge impact on not only like the relationship between your boss, but also how you viewed your relation to that capital, that ability to possibly move up. It's only one step away as far as or as far as now goes. It's now 100 steps away, like unreachable.
I was just going to say, to build on what you just said, even before there were paper ballots, and with my accent, I'm going to massacre this. I never studied Latin, but for well into the period that we're talking about, you were exactly right. We used what was called viva voce voting. Not only could your boss see that you were marking your ballot, and quite often he might even have been one of the supervisors at the precinct where you voted, they could hear who you voted for. So, I mean, it was even a more public statement about your worldview and what you wanted to be influenced by who you voted for.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I mean, it's crazy to think about nowadays because that it seems just
Yes.
in a certain way undemocratic, because it is, that is a weird,
Right.
that is a pressure that is put on you as a voter that should, in my opinion, not be put on you. It should be your individual choice as a voter, as a person,
Exactly.
go, I want this, rather than your boss sitting next to you and then your landlord also over here, people
Right.
of power being able to see and then judge you based on that choice.
Right.
So, and again, that's just something I never really, we probably learned it. It wasn't really, it didn't stick in my brain like a lot of other stuff. So when I hear that again, I'm like,
Right.
that's crazy. That's insane.
Absolutely.
But then you also talked about people being thought of. That's where kind of the idea of people as commodities came. Like
Mhm.
somebody's labor is a commodity. So can you talk about that and how that was supported if it was supported in law, or if it was just a general
Uh,
sense of the time? Yeah, just talk a little bit more about that.
okay. Well, to prepare for your question, I did look into this a little bit, so I may sound a little smarter about this. I hope I do than I remember. But in terms of looking at a human being's labor as a commodity, that really came into widespread discussions because of the British philosopher Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations in the late 18th century. And he's considered, rightly or wrongly and broadly, as the father of modern capitalism.
Right.
Things, came out of a lot of things came out of his theories and postulations about laissez-faire and the free market and all of that. But um, the idea of a human being or their labor being a commodity, ironically coming out of Adam Smith, was into the 19th century. From the 19th century onward, it became almost a Marxian theory, because Karl Marx picked up what Adam Smith um, first put out, followed by I believe it was David Ricardo, and then with Karl Marx. But the idea of, if you look at the means of production and human labor, then the cost of the labor translating to then the eventual price of the product. One of the reasons for that transmission into, from it first being talked about by the man who's considered the father of capitalism, ironically then becoming a concept most closely associated with a Marxist, has to do with people, because the element of this commodification, how I was taught it, had to do with what came to be called the labor theory of value. And that's really where you see, by although there were workers' associations that predate the founding of our republic. But if you look at, for example, I think it came out in 1984, Sean Wilentz's book, Chants Democratic. Have you run across that book
I have not.
before?
No. Chance Democratic. Okay.
Chants Democratic. Chants Democratic. Sean Wilentz was part of a group of labor historians who were very active in the 70s and 80s. If you want to know about American labor history, the canon, if you will, the core works are Chants Democratic by Sean Wilentz, that came out in '84. Herbert Gutman, Life, Work, and Society, that came out shortly before 1976. And then David Montgomery's The Fall of the House of Labor, came out in the late 80s.
Okay.
What these three men and others that they worked with looked at, the reality of working life in America, and how, for example, with Wilentz and Chants Democratic, it's essentially a study of the working people of New York City.
Okay.
And the formation of the influence of the people who lived and worked in New York City between the 1780s and 1830, and the forming of what became the core identity of working class people in America. And then Gutman and I said they were all sort of in graduate school and coming out and publishing their big works about the same time. So I can't, please don't hold me to a timeline of scholarship, but they were in the mix and they all knew each other. And what they were saying was that right from the beginning of our republic, while in school we got taught the founding fathers, the political leaders,
Right.
Washington, Jefferson, Adams, that at the same time there was this ferment of working class people who got involved, who were very motivated and active in the struggles that we now call the period of the American Revolution. And at its core was this idea of excuse me for the digression, but back to the labor theory of value, and the idea that someone's work or they themselves were a commodity. It grew out of that there has always been in the consciousness of working people in this country that it's their labor that adds to or is the key component of the ultimate value of the product that they produce. And
Okay.
therefore in a person with working class consciousness in America, it's you couldn't get that coal out of the coal mine if I didn't pick it, right?
Right.
An auto worker all the way up through to today, someone working on an assembly line in a factory. They're not just a machine tender. It's if they weren't there, then could the owner of that factory produce the car? It's that idea, and that's why you've got this juxtaposition of a capitalist, and then of course Marx himself coming up with this Marxian look at, but it's the labor theory of value, in my opinion. That's what I look to when I think about the commodification of labor and the value of someone's work and the value of their time. Because the last, especially by the last quarter of the 19th century, especially, is when you have the great conflicts between labor and capital emerging. And that commodification and the labor theory of value is right at the core. But don't ever forget that it was there from the beginning.
From the very beginning.
What Sean Wilentz. I'll give you an example. One of the lesser known, but still widely known stories out of the American Revolution was the death of Crispus Attucks at the Boston Massacre, right? Do you know who was in the crowd? Do you know what Crispus Attucks did for a living?
I actually read this. I've been reading People's History of the United States, and I actually have been meaning to look it up because I forget what. Can you please remind me?
He was a dock worker.
Okay, he was a dock worker. Okay.
And see, that's what I mean. That crowd, and that's what Sean Wilentz and Montgomery and Herbert Gutman and the other great labor historians were saying was, yes, Jefferson and Adams were sitting in Philadelphia. Washington was leading the army around, but at things like what came to be called the Boston Massacre, that was a bunch of dock workers.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And they were just as involved.
Right. And so kind of going back a little bit to that commodity, it is, no, you're good. It is interesting that you say that, because it is how I've always heard it, is from that more capital critical side, where it is, that is a bad thing, that people have viewed it as a commodity, because then it leads to obviously like exploitation and being able to pass laws that go, hey, since you are a commodity and you are limiting that commodity yourself, your own work for people, that's, illegal. And so to see that from the other side and go, no, we also understand that, but we understand that from a capitalist perspective of we need you to make our stuff. So we're going to treat you like that commodity, like a commodity street, because it is
Right.
without that commodity of work, we would be unable to, function as a corporation
Right.
or an industry. Yeah, very, very interesting. And when I first heard that, that is something that has just been rolling around my mind, because that is in some way still how it's kind of valued and how certain people think. There just aren't necessarily laws or legislation that kind of reaffirms that in the sense that it was, earlier in America's history. And so with that, I guess we can go into the Sherman antitrust law. This is a big one. I feel like everyone learns about this in like middle school or high school, relating to like the Teapot Dome scandal and other stuff that kind of preceded it. But can you kind of describe actually like why this was passed and then how it was enforced both against corporations, but against unions and labor organizing as well?
Okay. Well, one of the things that I don't think the dots get connected very well when we're young in history is that in the 19th century, as these great changes were taking place and how people worked and lived and things that how things were created. For example, we don't teach kids to think about the fact that there was this change between where they got food, where people got food, how people ate, how our clothes were made. I mean, we started the century with people growing their own food or buying it locally, regionally, and clothes were tended to be homemade. By the end of the century, again, within 100 years, we were buying our clothing and things ready-made. We were buying ready-made furniture. That's the dramatic change. So coming back, I promise, to the Sherman Antitrust Act. One of the other things that the two other things that we don't know, to put this in perspective, I think, is there was no public social welfare net under people. You worked or you relied on familial or local charity. How that comes into factor here is over the course of the 19th century, there was what we would call today minimally either a recession or a depression roughly every 20 years. So to understand the Sherman Antitrust Act, you have to understand that there were people and even politicians who were saying this boom bust cycle, feast or famine cycle in our economy, that has to change. And so it's interesting when you posed that question to me, I started thinking about the fact that so much came out of Ohio, right? We've got Virginia and Ohio have given us the highest number of presidents in our entire history. The election that marked the change in the fundamental nature of our presidential elections came with William McKinley, and the man behind William McKinley was Mark Hanna of Ohio. Sherman of the Sherman Antitrust Act was from Ohio. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not know that. That is new to me. Okay.
And he was considered, and I don't know that much about him other than in his basic biographical profiles, he's identified as an expert on the regulation of commerce. So the Sherman Antitrust Act comes out of, there's this, again, roughly 20-year period. There's the Panic of 1873. Panic was the 19th century word for depression.
Right.
20 years later, there's the Panic of 1893. It's kind of like medieval scholars arguing how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. you ought to see a bunch of historians talking about which was worse, the Panic of 1893 or the Great Depression, because
Okay.
they're right there together.
Mhm.
It's all depending on how you squash the numbers up. But anyway you cut it, the Panic of 1893, 1 in 5 American wage earners was out of work.
Mhm.
So shortly before that is when you have, so if you look at this period bookended by the Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893, that's where this flurry of legislation comes out. The Interstate Commerce Act is passed in 1881, 1883. There are a number, 2 or 3 major cases that ultimately end up in the Supreme Court. Then there's the legislation that came out in 1887, and then the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed in 1890. And to try to answer the specifics of your question, the other factor that comes into play here is, have you heard of anyone talk about the 14th Amendment
Not
in
much.
the
No.
context of business history?
No. No.
Well, well, a few minutes ago, before I went on one of my rambles, you asked about the use of these laws against unions versus the use of them against corporations.
Right.
And so with people like Sherman, they began to pass things like the Interstate Commerce Act, culminating in the Sherman Antitrust Act 9 years later, with this idea of, could they arrest, could they stop this boom bust cycle? Because, for example, the aftermath of the 1873 panic, again, thinking of it as a depression, as we're learning now, it's almost like an earthquake. There's the main event, and then there are aftershocks. And so there were aftershocks to the economy that were every 2 or 3 years between 1873 and 1890. So they were trying to control that. The Sherman Antitrust Act was primarily focused on, again, trying to regulate commerce and to prevent what they called it in the 19th century restraint of trade. And the simple answer is that was easier to prove in a court of law, both of them, against unions than it was against a corporation.
Right.
And in part, it was because a U.S. senator who saw that the more lucrative side of the street, if you will, named Roscoe Conkling. Roscoe Conkling is considered one of the architects of how business came to use the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And basically, he was the architect of making it so that a corporation had personhood. A corporation could be a person before the law.
And that
so when I talked,
that is proceeding, obviously. I'm blanking on it now. The Supreme Court case from 20 years ago that basically then did say corporations are people. In the eyes of the law, they are the same as people. So
right.
With that, it's kind of been a principle for longer, but it is now just it's only recently become law, I guess is a way to say it.
Yeah, and so, well, what I tell my students is, so imagine if you're a coal miner and have just joined the newly formed in 1890 the United Mine Workers of America, and you try to take the corporation that owns the company that you're working for, you try to take them to court. Who do you think has the deeper pockets to fight that court battle?
Right. to a corporation. Always. Always. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. It's almost like, not to sound determinist, but well-intentioned things always seem to turn out to benefit the people that it was meant to control.
Right. And with that, I mean, it does definitely seem well intentioned. Yeah, like well intentions, but then in the matter of fact, when rubber meets road, you know, then it always is, well,
Yeah.
actually, when, and obviously at that point too, with the great railroad strikes that followed the panic of the 1890s, and with Eugene Debs, that definitely seemed like they, you know, since they didn't really, national labor unions were still forming at that point. There was no, it wasn't, you know, cemented like it is now, or in the past, you know, in the 20th century. So it seems like, especially then, like at that junction, they, not to say they didn't have a chance, but it seemed like they didn't have a chance because it was, you didn't have, you know, the strong institution of unions and everything with that, like union dues being paid and whatnot to help with certain cases like that. Yeah, that definitely, right. And that's when reading about that, of how, yeah, no, they passed, again, learning in high school, it's like, oh, the Antitrust Act, you know, that was to help, you know, break up big business and everything. And then you actually learning about how it was used, a lot of times you go, well, it's more so used against unions to help fight the unions against the corporations, you know. So it definitely, again, another one of those pockets of history that is like, we learned it a little differently, and that might not be the complete accurate story that is true in American history.
Right. Especially when you look at the progression of violence, if you will, because the first great violent strike, if you will, is the Great Railway Strike of 1877. You've got the Great Railway Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair event in 1886. Then there's Homestead in Pennsylvania in 1892, and then Pullman outside of Chicago in 1894. And it's all wrapped up in together. But the Great Railway Strike of 1877 was another one of those epochal moments in American history, because, again, thinking about the fact that we went from being a regionally focused nation to a national entity in that time period. That's one of the lessons that not many people think of when they think of Reconstruction and the ascendancy of the Republican Party in the aftermath of the Civil War, was that idea, which is now, if I may digress just for a moment into the current situation, that's what's reappeared, is this idea of, are we state-based? Are we regionally based? Or are we a national entity? And it was the Civil War. The Civil War was in the U.S. Civil War, in some respects, in that respect, was the final act of the American Revolution, because we had remained a regional, loosely tied together republic. The Civil War and its aftermath and the Reconstruction, the Republicans, with their ascendancy and their unchecked authority, said, no, we're a single nation. And unfortunately for the cause of labor in this country, that's what happened. Was when we became a national organization, and the railroad was the skeleton, if you will, of that. It was the core of everything, because that's what let us move goods and services, right? And that's why, in trying to help regulate the economy, that's why you see the Interstate Commerce Act, which was, if you cross state lines, if you impede, if you interrupt the transmission of or transportation of goods across state lines, then that's a federal crime and we'll come after you. And that's what I mean. It was easier to go after labor unions to do that. Great Railway Strike, the railway workers go on strike, and at Martinsburg, West Virginia, nothing in any direction out of that hub got anywhere. And again, one of those aspects of the story that's not told is when those railway workers first went on strike, the people living in that community, that was, hey, that's Jim, that's so-and-so's cousin. The local communities took those guys food. They supported those workers. But when the owners of the railroad brought in the private police force and there were violent clashes, and then the owners of the railroad appealed to President Hayes and said, help us here. The very first interventionary act by U.S. troops on a labor issue at the Great Railway Strike was to help shut down.
Right. And
it was to stop the violence, but it effectively shut down the strike.
Yeah, it was stopping the violence, but not giving any gains or anything to the employees themselves.
Same thing happened at Homestead. Same thing happened at Pullman. The pivot point and the best work on Haymarket was written by. We were not close friends, but I helped him with a later work. A man named Jim Green, who wrote A Death in Haymarket. If you want to understand why the labor movement in this country has just operated under a shadow, you have to read that, because what happened was the Haymarket affair. There was a strike, one of those strikes at the McCormick Reaper Harvester factory outside of Chicago. And in one respect, unfortunately for the workers at that factory, a local cell of a largely pacifist, but they were anarchists in Chicago, sought to support the strikers' efforts. There was a public meeting, a rally in support of the workers in Haymarket Square in Chicago. A bomb was thrown and people were killed. And I don't even want to try to say any more about it other than say read Jim Green's book.
Yeah.
But it's out of Haymarket then that the cause of American labor is going to be from that point on forever overshadowed by this smear, if you will, of radicalism.
Okay, so Haymarket was the event that really tied
Haymarket was
the labor movement with a radical labor movement, even though they weren't
a radical,
essence,
a radical political movement.
Right, with the anarchism. Yes.
Yes, that was the linkage, because from that point on, to say, like I said, the important connector is to think, no, wait a minute, this idea of working people banding together to advocate for, to fight for, and protect their own interests has been there from the beginning. But Haymarket is the turning point, because from that point on, if they could throw it out quickly enough and make it stick, opponents of the working people could say to everyone else, don't support them. They're a bunch of commies. And I hope you don't mind, because we're just getting rolling on my favorite part of this story.
Oh, yes. And that is one of the parts I'm most interested in, because it does seem like the kind of just going off what we were talking before, it does seem like after the Civil War, and that was one of my questions, obviously, is and this was one, actually, Mark Louse, who he was at UC, he has a book called Free Labor about labor in the 19th century as well, talk about mostly during the Civil War and a little bit after. And it does seem, one of the things that just sparked an idea in my head was talking about how during the Civil War, they would, hijack rail cars and railways. And then seeing that later used in labor union battles, in battles with like private police and private armies. Then it just went, oh, is is that connected? Because definitely like some of those people who maybe learned those tactics during the Civil War possibly then use those in the later battles with labor or against labor, or you know,
Mm-hmm.
and so it definitely seems. But that's very interesting that Haymarket was that first, because that obviously seems like a big event, and I feel like something. Oh, it kind of rubs me the wrong way where it's the Haymarket Affair. It seems a very light name to give it, even though it's a very serious subject, and especially the because we were just talking about how you know the bombing happened, and then
Mm-hmm.
subsequently practically a witch hunt happened to then
Right.
go, okay, you anarchists, this was you, we're going to hang you or imprison you, there you go, without any real. I mean, one of the guys who was accused and then I think he was later acquitted, but was at a bar after he gave a speech. He went to a bar, was just drinking when the bomb went off, and then went, "Oh, what happened?" And then he got arrested because of it, because he was just an anarchist.
Right.
So that's very interesting that that was kind of the inception of that. You know, oh, you're an anarchist, and then later, oh, you're a socialist, oh, you're a communist, and all the troubles that came with that as well, with that title being attached to labor.
Exactly. And one of the things that and please, if I'm telling you things that you already know, don't. It's just, again, because I'm a native of Virginia. My family's from Southern West Virginia. When I finished my PhD, I went to Georgia to teach and then came back to Kentucky. People really don't get taught labor history in the South. I'm just saying. Um, and so one of the things that's pivotal for me to introduce to students when I talk about Haymarket is not only is that smear, quote unquote, smear of radicalism, political radicalism attached to labor. The anarchists in Chicago who were trying to support this McCormick Reaper Harvester strike, the leader of, well, he, of course, he wouldn't have said he was the leader, but one of the people that became a focal point for the trial of the anarchists who were rounded up and put on trial for that, like you said, even though most of them were at best marginally affected or part of that issue,
Right.
was Albert Parsons, who was married to a mixed race woman. They were from Texas. Lucy Parsons. A lot of people, if you forget, somebody's written just in the last 20, 30 years, written a new biography of Lucy Parsons. And a lot of people say it was Lucy who was the real radical anarchist in that pair, but they were an interracial couple and they couldn't stay in Texas. So they had moved to Chicago and were welcomed into this group. So there's the political radicalism, there's the racial mixing component, and then several of the men who were hanged along with Albert were German Jews. So there's this, the anti-radical, anti-worker movement strain, if you will, in American society sense. It's also anti-Semitic.
In that, and that's also something that was interesting finding all throughout labor history is, and that's kind of the things I'm trying to pinpoint, because it seems like the biggest failures of labor to overcome is these ideas of race and gender and nationality, skilled and unskilled, like all of those things were used constantly to divide labor,
Right.
like over and over and over and over. Like it is throughout the entire history of labor from the beginning of. I mean, I was just again, I mentioned reading people's history, and small tangent, but in the 17th or in the 6th or sorry, no, 18th century, also in the 17th century, when indentured servants were being brought over and chattel slavery as a practice was being developed, you would have these rebellions of these indentured servants and these slaves both coming together to fight back against the people who owned them. And then it was only really when the indentured servants were given a little bit of a leg up where it goes, you know what, actually, we'll give you, we'll give you some more food, we'll give you some, some liquor to go with it, some whiskey, and maybe lessen your conditions or lessen the worsening of conditions that you have. Then it became oh, okay, well now we're a little bit step up. And then that started to fade away, as well as when those divisions were inflamed. And that's something very interesting that we also don't learn is like why racism as a concept is a thing and how it benefited the system of America starting off, because it
Right.
was just a mechanism to go, hey, they're different than you, so you don't have to feel bad about this or even really think about it that much. Yeah,
And I know I have many colleagues who would say, Becky, it's an oversimplification. And I'm like, yes, but if it gets young people today to understand that once somebody understands an essence of something, then you can expand on it. But if you think about the essence of race-based slavery in this nation, and you look at Bacon's Rebellion, like you just said, in 1676, between 1619, when the first Africans ended up in Jamestown, in the Virginia colony, from 1619 to 1676, when Bacon's Rebellion takes place, it was not a given that if you had African blood, that you were going to be enslaved.
right.
There was someone who, if he wasn't in that first group of 20, he was shortly thereafter. There was an African-born man who ended up owning several hundred acres in Virginia and was as well off as many of his neighbors. But with Bacon's Rebellion, those folks out on the frontier, where once a person of African descent had ended their indenture or whatever, the white poor and the black and the mixed race with the indigenous First Nations Indian peoples, they were all pushed out on the frontier to fight. When that fight couldn't be contained and it turned east and it went to Jamestown, it was then that I tell my students, it's an oversimplification, but from a legal perspective, the folks running the Virginia colony needed to be able to look at somebody and say, are they light? Are they dark? Well, then if they're dark, chances are they should be an enslaved person.
Right. And I've heard that as well. Where it sounds very bad because it is just like oh, well, we just need a marker, like a clear defining marker to go, okay, you are labor that we, have to pay a certain amount, have to give you something, have to appease you in some way. And then the other side where you are labor that we don't, period. You are our property. In seeing it in that aspect feels very cold, but it also is how they did see it. And it is almost like a crueler view of history, where it is, yeah, no, you didn't even, you did it because it was practical. It made sense for that system. And it was just the easiest thing to do, which is just sad thinking about.
And back to our focal conversation of labor and capital, when you come to look at the industry that I did my work in, and technically I'm not a labor historian, but the industry that I know best is coal mining. Before the process of getting the coal out of the mine to the railway car to ship it was mechanized, it required mules or horses or dogs that had to be trained to accept being in the total dark, right? So it took a lot of effort to take care of those horses, or in some occasion dogs or ponies. And there's actually it's awful to say this, but it gets back to that idea of a human being being a commodity in the process of production. There's at least one instance of when there's a disaster, when there's an explosion at a mine. Have you heard this story?
I don't think so. No.
And a bunch of men, and of course the pit ponies, or the horses or mules. I forget if it was pit ponies or mules were killed. And the local superintendent telegrammed the owner that the explosion had taken place, and how, that it was going to take time, to clear it. And the guy, he literally got a telegram back, said basically, forget the men. How many ponies did we lose?
Because it was harder to
It was
get
harder.
a trained pony for that, or a mule for that, than the men. You can find men, and that's and there's and there's similar but also different, where there's that quote from, I think it was Jay Gould who said it. It's like, I can pit half the workers against the other half of the workers.
Exactly.
And it does seems like that, where it is just like you are treated as you are seen, which is a commodity, or at least in the the 19th century. And that is how they were viewed, how they were talked about, which also, and we can kind of get into this, it also seemed like a shocking, it must have been a shocking feeling, because it's not even just these people who have been in the industrial age. They are seeing the industrial age come about as art, as they are artisans, and as their crafts are being, like shoemaking and
yes,
all these different things are being industrialized and like you said, ready-made products. And so their own engine that drives them, which is that artisan engine, it then is dismantled basically in the eyes of being able to make cheaper commodities for people. And so can you kind of talk about that and how that affected workers' views of themselves as workers and their labor in general?
Well, you just touched on what is considered one of the essential dilemmas of understanding the evolution of unions in this country, because, and I almost said it, the first unions were trade unions. And trade unionism and and the Industrial Revolution, they move forward in tandem, sadly enough. But in the early years, in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, the first workers to successfully band together and through strikes, through other forms of advocacy or whatever, they could protect themselves and argue for higher wages and better conditions if it was harder to replace them. So the railway workers, Samuel Gompers, who was the first great leader of the American Federation of Labor, he was a cigar maker, right? And that was skilled labor. So a person's skill became part of their value. If it was harder, if it took time to train someone to do something, the whole process of being a novice, then a journeyman, then a skilled tradesman, that gave the early workers and the early workers organization some protection. But mechanization was the great leveler of all of that. For example, some people today wouldn't think about it this way, because we only know now mechanized coal mining, but coal mining was a skilled trade, and the skill they actually recruited. There were almost like people trade wars between the United States and Great Britain, because the skilled coal miners were from Wales, parts of northwestern England, and a part of Scotland. And the Welsh who came to America, my PhD mentor, Ron Lewis, has written a book about Welsh coal miners. He's of Welsh descent. So this is his family line. Those Welsh coal miners, John L. Lewis, the great American labor leader, starting with the EMWA, was of Welsh descent. And that was their essential thing. You can't replace me. I'm not just a body. I have a skill. I know how to do this work. And if you try to get rid of me, well, fat chance that you'll replace me easily. But with mechanization, that leveled it. And like Henry Ford, people think Henry Ford invented the automobile. He didn't. What he did was he was the pioneer of bringing the assembly line into car manufacturing. And a very similar thing happened in coal mining, where a Welsh coal miner had to know the entire process of how to read the coal seam. Where was the place to put the dynamite that would blow down the coal without blowing up the mine? You see, I mean, there were all these steps to knowing how to do that. Then with first the cutting machines, and then the evolution of that whole process, again, you went from being someone who had to know how to do something to tending a machine.
Right.
And that's the great visual imagery of that is Charlie Chaplin's movie. I think it was Modern Times,
Mm-hmm.
where he literally is this guy. He's going through the machine. That's what it was like. But I don't think I answered your question.
No, I think that answered it fairly well. I mean, just like changing how how workers viewed themselves and their work
Right. Right.
from the 1830s to the dawn of the 20th century. And I do think, and that's what I see repeatedly, is that it is this in the face of this industrialization,
Mm-hmm.
of knowing every single part, them going to doing one thing over and over again, and also realizing how that is also interlinked with other things, like just on a small tangent, but with the banning of alcohol and liquor in America,
Mm,
and the
right.
reasoning why behind. Because I never really in class, I feel like in school, I never learned a lot of like the main reasons why, or at least some of the main reasons why, and then learning that it was actually because of partially the labor conditions that these men had to go under in the transformation of their labor, then coming home to their wives, and then
Right.
unfortunately drinking a lot, and then a lot of violence came from that within
Right.
their own homes, and then obviously that came at the same time as the suffrage movement. So
Mm-hmm.
both of those are interlinked with each other, of
Right.
women going, hey, we have a voice, and also we are not going to suffer this abuse anymore. Um, Knowing that is very interesting, and how that relates to that industrialization and change of labor. So I do think you answered it well enough. I think that is a
Okay.
good way of looking at it. But and that is, and to kind of go off of that, so obviously we were talking about violence before, and you were talking about how
Mhm.
kind of like a lot of miners who came over were Welsh descent. Um, eh, can you talk about a little bit how European labor might have been a little bit different than American labor? How European laborers then coming over to America saw American labor? Because obviously it was very different, and especially with the violence in America against
Right.
American labor, very different as well.
Right. Well, that's another one of the great conundrums. Um, in the British Isles, for example, the, people will say, well, why was there never a working class consciousness or entity or awareness like there was in Europe? And it's because we are not ethnically or racially homogenous, which in the time period that we're talking about, Britain is a polyglot nation today as well. So is France. They're very proud, but that's a byproduct of their colonialism and much later colonial period. But they started out, they were racially homogenous, or somehow racially, ethnically, or religiously homogenous. And there was an almost, especially in Great Britain, there was a caste-like strength to the consciousness in Britain. How you spoke could immediately identify you as whether or not you were high class or low class, working class or leisure class. And by contrast, the United States, with the offset of enslavement, of people of African descent. With that offset, as long as you were white and male and willing to step up and take the oath to the Constitution, you could be a citizen. And so that was sort of like, those were the little holes that got punched in the whether or not we were going to have the class-based homogeneity that would have given a natural lift to working class consciousness, right? That was the safety valve. That was the relief valve of greater conflict in this country, because right from the beginning, people were sold this idea of, well, if I work hard enough and save and I'm sober, all of these things, if I do that, I can be an owner. I could be a rich man. I mean, the person whose shoulders that sits on most squarely is the great Scottish immigrant Andrew Carnegie. That's what he believed. And that's what he was the cultivator of his own myth, that the myth of the self-made man was one of the things that it was just so hard, virtually impossible, for the American labor movement to overcome.
And I would say even now it's still prevalent.
Oh,
I mean, that is absolutely something that,
very much so.
I mean, I hear even friends say, well, if you work hard enough, you can make it. And I think, and I do think there are many reasons why, there's, and many people have many ideas, that Europe had feudalism, so that people, in Eric Foner's piece on Why Is There No Socialism from the 80s, he cites at length, I forget the name, but somebody wrote in the 1860s about how people in Europe, see themselves as a different class, like you said, where it is from speech, even you can immediately go, okay, you're upper class, I'm lower class, we are two different people, and we're never going to be like the same. I'm never going to be at your place in the economic position or political position. Where in America, you have not only a closer, tie to your boss, but also, we already got democracy. If you have land, you can vote. So all these factors that mitigate that feeling, that go, no, you're actually far closer to them, even if you're not. It has that feeling, or it reinforces that feeling of, I am close to my boss. I could be my boss, which people still have nowadays, even as that dream is crumbling, and it's crumbled many times and being reformed and then crumbled again. It's very interesting that that idea has persisted for so long in American history, that we are all the same class in a sense, when in actuality it's a little different. It's a lot more divided, especially now when you have just this giant difference between the have and the have-nots that is growing every day. And kind of with that, one of my last questions I want to ask is,
okay,
how do you see any mirrors with like today versus like the Gilded Age? Like how, because it seems like I've heard other people say this, I feel
we're in a new
Gilded Age, right? Because it seems like we haven't had any constitutional, any radical change to the Constitution or the way our economic system works in the past 50 years, which we kind of left off with Reagan, made a bunch of changes, and we just have kind of skirted on that liberalism ever since. And so it seems like now that's biting us a little bit, because we haven't made any of these changes, which is only growing this divide. So is there any similarity with how that kind of worked in the Gilded Age and the policies that helped usher in the Gilded Age with compared to now, and the policies that helped usher in this new Gilded Age, or is it completely different?
Oh no. I mean, writ large, right? The comparisons break down when you get down to the nuts and bolts of everyday thing. And forgive me for the sound of mowing.
Yeah, you're good. I don't think I can hear it. So yeah, you're
okay, good. The reason why I would argue we're in a new Gilded Age is, one, the concentration of wealth. That marker is right there again. Number two, the part of, at least for now, that resurgent blip of unionism that came about this past year with, it's hard to believe, but President Biden was the very first American president to ever stand on a picket line to support the workers. And yet most of the working people I know don't have a very high opinion of President Biden. They still hold a higher opinion of former President Trump. And it's that's those same issues of division. There's something that, because of the narrative of our national history has been controlled, collectively, most Americans still recoil from the idea of modern unionism, of the idea of one big union. If you work for a living, you're one of us versus one of them, because as an aspirational society and a very materialistic society, most people want to be one of them, not one of us. But that sort the blip that came up with in the last year is when enough people can be swayed, that balance of the haves and the have-nots has tipped unfairly. That's when change occurs. That happened with the Great Depression and the New Deal.
And it seems like that is, I do see with the unionization efforts at, service industries like Starbucks and different coffee shops, as well as, janitors and just, people in the service industry kind of recapitulating and go, we are the workers. We are the modern workers of America. Obviously, there are still some industrial jobs, but like those are fading and have faded over the past, 4 or 5 decades. So, yeah, redefining what a worker is and going, we are the workers of today, and we also deserve rights that we don't have. I mean, it was insane. I didn't even know that was something they were fighting for, but the Starbucks workers had just recently gotten digital tipping. That was one of their big things. Was most people buy coffee with cards, so a lot of people don't carry a lot of cash on them, so they need a tip, digitally. But for until the past few weeks, you could not do that. That was just not a thing because it didn't affect the big business. It just affected the workers. And so it does seem like this, the fact that we don't really have strong unions now. And obviously during the Gilded Age, unions were coming up, but, it still wasn't crazy strong. Like national unions as we had them in like the 30s, 40s, 50s did not exist. They were only in their infancy. So seeing that kind of similarity between, workers trying to form, kind of get together, both in the Gilded Age and the late 1800s, and then now, it definitely does inspire some hope in me for, and especially I talked about this with Tracy K. Meyer as well, where it does, people I talk to, people my age, I'm only 24, but a lot of the younger people have realized, we have not gotten the best deal. The deal we got of go to college and you'll be able to get a job hasn't worked out. It stopped working, a while ago, but we're still selling that to everyone in high school. So it is something that I see kind of forming, this consciousness of it, like a literal class consciousness in America. And I do think we are seeing the beginnings of that possible difference of, hey, I know I'm not going to be, like, I will never be you. A Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. So why would I try for that rather than maybe I can try to just make my life and my job that I have now better than, than it is currently.
I'll give you a contrast in experience. And this is what I mean about, sometimes it's well-intentioned reforms and sometimes it's things that people slide in. And we don't realize for decades, even the impact of things. I'm 58. When I went to college, I could earn not the entirety of what I needed for an academic year, but I could pay the bill for my room and board with a summer job when a minimum wage summer job at a state university in my home state of Virginia. I went to the College of William and Mary. My first room and board bill was $3,800 for my first year of school. But, and this is both parties. That's going to be something that'll be, it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out by the time that I die, is if we might be on the verge of a major realignment of the parties. That's another given. People today don't realize that periodically throughout American history, we've had whole new parties emerge, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's one of the things. So when I say that, both of our, because we've been a binary system politically for my lifetime, both Democrats and Republicans, state, local and federal, were the architects of why now going to college is such an exorbitant experience, right? Millionaire capitalists, industrialists, they can declare bankruptcy and walk away from their debt. Indebted college students cannot.
Right.
And that is just so fundamentally unfair. But both parties join hands and are responsible for that. Another thing that I think is going on today is that, again, as far back as Alexis de Tocqueville writing about America, Americans and our fundamental cultural identity are ahistorical people. We don't have a historical consciousness the way that people in Britain or France or any other nation really. Again, is it because of the homogeneity? Is it because of the identity? We don't know. But right from the beginning, we were ahistorical. And so, and that works against common everyday people.
Right. Yeah. No, it's if you have, and especially this, because I think a lot of the history we do have of America is, it is very propaganda like, where it is, we were the first to do this, we were the first to do that. And so then if you kind of try to push back on that with a lot of people, you get a very a lot of times very like angry response, because it is something that is like embedded, I think, in people's minds and hearts, even, of like, no, we're we have a lot to be proud of, which I think we do, but at the same time we never learn about these pitfalls of American history, and where people have been kind of brushed under the rug, and don't think about them, because they're American history great except for that section, and that section, so try to kind of smooth over those bumps of maybe the problematic parts of American history, or the parts that aren't the easiest to define. And okay, we're good and bad. It's very complicated. Like, again, with all of labor history as well. So
yeah, and not to bring it to presentists and currently, but what made me aware of this, again, of this ahistoricity in our culture, I rely on someone to come clean my house once a month. And I was trying to talk to her about how she sees things. And she says, the tax on my house just went up. In 3 years, $1,100. This is what I pay for gas. This is what I pay for food. It was cheaper under the last guy.
Yeah.
So why would I vote for the current guy? And I could talk to her until I'm blue in the face. I tried to say, no, our economy was not better under the previous guy. And here's all the evidence that it doesn't. That's when the danger in the ahistorical perspective in American society is it's part of what keeps these cycles of exploitation and uprising and ferment, and then we reach a new stasis, And then, something happens and we reach crisis again and consensus and then stasis. It's the ongoing cycle.
Yeah, and I do think kind of just going off of that, where it is you can tell people as much as you want. It was better. It was like this is, it's the first. It's worse because this is the first time we've had inflation in 50 years. Like obviously that is going to be worse. But then you can also talk about, okay, well, that is actually a lot of corporations just realizing, take the opportunity. Oh, we can actually hike up prices, and everybody else is doing it, so we can call it's inflation. But it's like, what? Okay, who sets that bar though? The people who are selling the thing, so that the blame should go to them, not to the. But of course, the president has become the symbol of anything right or wrong, anything that happens, it's on them, which I think to some extent is warranted, but to some other extent like that, which is economic, it's more feeling based, where it's like you can, the economy is better, but people, me included, feel that it's worse because when you go to the grocery store and you go, oh, that's more expensive, then it's like, oh, who do I blame? The guy who's, at the top. But it's much more complicated than that. But again, the second you go into that complication, then it's like, it's a lot. That's a lot to go through. That's a lot to think about, and a lot that in the end people can't do a lot about. Like, people can vote for the president. People can't vote out corporations. That it's not something people can do. So it's much easier to go, okay, well, I can vote this guy out, try the other guy again, see if it gets better, which I would say, no, it's not going to. Like, I think, at least personally, the point that we're at, I feel like we need like a new deal. Like, we need another new deal. We need something, because it's not working for a vast majority of this country, and is only going to continue to not work and get worse, most likely, for most people in this country. And with that, we need something else. We need a recapitulation of what it means to be an American and be a working American. And so the go to college and get a job that pays you, it stopped working a while ago, and we're all realizing it. I mean, it's very bad that you have to go to college, get your degree, and then go in the job market and go, oh, that was a lie. that was not true. That's a very harsh reality for a lot of people, me included. Like, that is something that I realized, and that I have many other friends who realized that too, but it came too late. When you, luckily, shout out to NKU, I had scholarships that covered most of that cost, but I know other people who chose a college when they were 18, and it was an expensive college, but you think, well, I can pay it off because I'll have a job eventually. And you're not really thinking about that until you get there and you go, now I can't get a job. And now I have this debt I have to pay. And then you go, well, why did they sell me that? Why did I buy into it? And I don't fault anyone for buying into it, because that's what you're told throughout most of your education. I'm not saying college is a bad thing, but it is becoming less and less feasible for people to go to and then go out of and get a job that pays enough to either pay off that debt or just to be able to live.
Well, we could be 20 years away from a new apotheosis of labor, because I've been talking to a lot of my students, because I've tried to switch to a skills-based approach in what I teach, because one of the graduate students that I'm mentoring right now is a department manager at one of the large local corporations, and she makes $16,000 a year more than I do. And because she has a trade background, and that's what I think could change, because your generation, I think, is going to be the final generation that says, you know what, we've been lied to. Why would I want to go take on that debt of a college degree with no promise of work? But right now, the trade skills level infrastructure in this country, we're hurting. We don't have enough plumbers. We don't have enough mechanics. We don't have enough of those folks. And there's a system by which you can get into those, get trained, and it's not the same kind of work, but there's a lot to be said for having a skill and within 3 or 4 years be making what it costs to have a reasonably comfortable life in this country versus incurring a debt that will saddle you for most of your adult life without a promise of a job on the other end. There's a reckoning. We're at a reckoning point. Like I think you were saying, just like the Civil War was a reckoning point, the Great Depression, the New Deal, World War II, that 12-year period, we're there again.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like a lot of that does come, that reckoning usually comes with also that economic, downturn where it's already, we're not at a great position. We did a soft landing on this recession that we were supposed to have. But knowing how the system works and knowing that every 10, 15, 20 years you have a depression or recession, knowing that that will come and knowing the position people are already in, you go, well, that's not going to go well. Like that is going to be bad for a majority of people and turn out okay for a very few people. And so I seeing the recession of 2008 and the Occupy movement that came after that, and then especially like the COVID pandemic, and then the rise in unions. I do see a general trend of this class consciousness, this economic awareness of your position as a worker or just as somebody who is lower on the rung, and then going, okay, well, what can I do about it? Because I got to do something, and nobody's doing anything for me, and that's why I'm a big believer of unions and labor unions, because I do think that is where people spend most of their time. And so I think if you can form a union, and there have been, I saw literally a study today that was showing that people who have states without right to work laws, and then subsequently who have stronger unions, every other worker, whether they're union or in a union or not, have better conditions, make more money in that state than in states like Kentucky that has a right to work law, and that unions are weaker because of that and many other policies that have been enforced over the past few decades. So I definitely I agree with you. I think we both agree we're at a reckoning point, and if we're not at one right now, we're definitely coming up on one soon. And as scary as it is, it's also I hear a lot of people my age or millennials say like I hate living through history. I wish we didn't have to live through history. Right. Which I get. I absolutely understand to a certain extent. But at the same time, it's also like I would like to live through these these hinge points of history so that we can maybe turn it in a better direction. Even if it's a small bit.
Right.
We still have the power, and more of a power than somebody in the 90s when everything was, oh, well, we're good. It's into history. Liberalism won. We're coasted now. It's all good. Free market. Yeah. And then give that another 30 years and you go, oh, it's not working out. Well, good. We're here now. We have at least some energy to do something about it. And I think definitely the biggest barrier to that is just getting people to organize in the age of the internet, where it's far harder to meet people in person and actually like create organizations that are boots on the ground. But I definitely think we are going towards that way, especially with not only people's dissatisfaction with work, but also people's dissatisfaction with the internet and how a lot of stuff has happened with that. So I see a good general trend. So it's not all doom and gloom, even though right now it's not the best time, but I definitely think there's a light at the end of the tunnel for this, where we will see a new age of workers' rights and just individuals' rights as well in America. I think, especially seeing the unity of people from obviously nationalities have kind of been, they're not as strong, I would say, in America at this point. And then, race and gender divisions, especially among younger people, like people my age, I think are a lot lesser. So I think those things that in the past have stopped labor and have barred us from really organizing effectively, I think a lot of those have kind of fallen to the wayside. A lot of those divisions have, there's always the chance that they can be inflamed by others trying to use them for their own motives. But I do think a lot of us, think there's no difference between me and you. Like there's more similarities than there are differences.
Yeah. Well, the thing that I've had a lot of thinking to do, because I come from working class people, and there's a profound political divide in my own family. And as a student of history, I've tried to make sense of what's going on. And I think one of the things that's also common in human nature is people are fundamentally motivated by either hope or fear. And that's why, as a member of my generation, I have my issues with the college age folks today. I'm not completely on board. I'm not capable of being. I lived my formative years were a different time, right?
Mhm.
Like you said, the 80s and 90s. It was a different time. I can't tell you how many times in the last 10 years I've had to look at my students and go, when I was your age, my professors would say, thank God y'all never have to deal with this. Well, we're back dealing with them again, right? Voting rights, issues over race and ethnicity, the border, immigration, gender, identity. But fundamentally, the reason why I am a hopeful person and looking forward into the future is one of the fundamentally positive things that I look at my 18 to 20 something year old students is fundamentally you're just better people. Yeah, my generation I came along when it was no longer okay to assume that someone of a different complexion or who had a different gender or sexual identity or any of that was lesser than other people, right? But that was one stage of progress I think we did make. I mean, I think there are more people in your generation who see people as people. And like you said, it's going to be harder if once your generation finds its core common causes to band together, it's going to be way harder to break you all apart, I
Well,
believe,
that
than
is
not.
very inspiring, I will say. That is, I am very glad you said that, because I do feel like there is this more human understanding within our generation. I will say not for everyone, but I think across the board, there's definitely a more genuine understanding of people's circumstances are not the same, but in the end, we are all human beings.
Right.
Period.
Because that's what's under assault,
Yeah.
right? That's what the political rights and the exercise of those political rights, the controlling of education, the banning of books. I'm a disabled person. So if, the idea of I'm just waiting. Actually, I forget what he said. There was a congressman recently who said something about, um, should people be allowed to it was people in care facilities. Should people in care facilities be allowed to vote? Does the fact that I use a mobility scooter mean that I'm not entitled to cast a vote, to exercise my political rights? That's the group of people in this country that are motivated by fear. They don't want things to change.
And that's unfortunate because change is the only constant in the world. And change, and I think that's part of the problem that we have right now is we are stagnant as a country with policy, economics, everything. And we are kind of in an age of a shrug where, it's, oh, you have a problem? Sorry, I guess you can try to deal with that, but I'm not changing anything. And I think, things have to change. Like they legitimately have to. There's no way things cannot change because conditions continue to change. People's views of things continue to change. So I do see, even though we have this very stubborn older block of people who are, creating the policy for future generations, I do believe that, we do have, in my generation, we have, the knowledge and the feeling as well that, okay, we are all in people. This is not making sense for us and for our generation. This doesn't does not align with our values, and even though that might benefit you, it's like it's not going to last. I would say the struggle is just the thing that I think when push comes to shove, when that happens, what will it look like is what everyone's kind of wondering when it will come about. But I think on that, I think that's a very good, hopeful ending for this. Looking forward and looking at the past, seeing how we got here, and then looking forward and seeing where we might go and what will look like. So with that,
can I mention one more book?
Yes, please.
Just one more, because it gets to the heart of what you were just saying, but it's not labor history. Has anyone mentioned to you Pauline Maier, The Old Revolutionaries?
No.
You need to read The Old Revolutionaries, because it's a group biography. It's chapter by chapter. It's a good introduction, for example, to Sam Adams and Richard Henry Lee. A case in point, Sam Adams was the counterpoint to his cousin John. So it was Sam Adams that was part of the Sons of Liberty. It's that working class group of Americans that were involved in the War for Independence. Richard Henry Lee is an example from Virginia of how Richard Henry Lee walked the walk and talked the talk. Even though he was from the planter class and all that, he actually did become convinced in racial equality. He is one of those Southerners who said, we're talking about freedoms, but we hold people enslaved. He freed his, and forgive me, it's an antiquated term now, but he freed his slaves. That's what I mean. He walked the walk. And so that's Pauline Maier's book. Again, it's another book. It's 40 years old, but it's something that, again, to show it's important for young people to see that there always has been a counter voice throughout American history. It wasn't, oh, well, we got to give people from the past a pass because they didn't know better. No, there were always people that knew better. And I just remembered one other person I've got to tell you about. When you see pictures from the civil rights movement of the 60s and Dr. King and others walking arm in arm, Walter Reuther, the great American labor leader, was one of those guys.
In that, just a side note on that, learning that, because obviously you learn about MLK in school, but in learning about his assassination as well, but not knowing why he was in Memphis during when he got assassinated, and learning that was for the rights of, I believe it was waste management workers, in marching with them for a union for better representation and better wages, in realizing that's why he was there. You never hear about him as a labor organizer, labor leader, because he was obviously a huge civil rights figure, but that goes hand in hand. It's intertwined, and you can separate it as far as teaching history, but really they work together. And so
or that he and Rosa Parks learned about the form of civil disobedience that they used at the Highlander School in Tennessee, which was formed by white Marxists in the 30s.
I did not know that. Interesting.
And that the March on Washington in 1963, the architect of that was Bayard Rustin, a gay Quaker black man who brought into fruition A. Philip Randolph, who was the black labor leader from the Railway Porters Union in the 1940s.
We can have a whole
sorry.
We will need a talk again, because I really want to talk to you more about kind of the early 1900s and kind of some of the violence that happened, but also some of the disputes with mine workers during then, as well as some of those movements later on in the 1900s, and how those were very intertwined with the labor movement as well. But I think we have discussed a lot today. Okay. I really appreciate you taking your time, Dr. Becky Bailey.
No, Dr. Rebecca Bailey.
Dr. Rebecca, not Becky. Sorry. The thing I was not supposed to say. Dr. Rebecca Bailey. thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining me. I really appreciate it. This was a enlightening discussion. I really think people will enjoy hearing more about labor and the 1800s and how that, and also labor in the future and how what we might look forward to with labor. So I really appreciate you jumping on.
Thank you, Jake. And check out the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. It's a new kind of museum. It's a people's museum, and it's in a place called Matewan, West Virginia, where what I studied. I don't know if you looked me up, but that's what they are, an openly, passionately affiliated with a variety of social justice movements, and including the United Mine Workers of America.
Okay.
And I've been working closely with them, and it'll be great. You'll love what you see.
I will have to check that out. It's not too far away from me, and I've been meaning to go to West Virginia soon, so I will definitely go check that out. I was also wanting to go to Blair Mountain, around that area, kind of check out that as well.
The March to Save Blair Mountain is why the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum exists.
Okay.
The folks who started that museum reached critical mass on the 2012 March to save Blair Mountain.
Wow.
I'll look more
into that. That's very interesting.
They were going to mountaintop removal Blair Mountain.
Wow. And
the site of the largest civilian insurrection since the U.S. Civil War.
Yeah. I will look more into that. That's very interesting, which also goes into ecological stuff as well, obviously. So, all right. Yeah. Well, we could go on for hours about this. I'm
sorry
sure.
For keeping you.
No, you are good. I could talk for so long about this. So thank you for this extended discussion. I really appreciate it.
Okay, Jake. Take care.
Yes, you too.
Holler at me when you can talk again.
I will. Trust me, I will. All right. See you, Rebecca.
Bye.